Go ahead and get us started with just some introductions. So, if folks would share in the chat your name, the organization you represent, and then your favorite back to school tradition. So, please feel free to keep sharing in the chat your name, organization, and any favorite back to school memories or traditions. In just a few minutes, we'll transition to a presentation from the Illinois Workforce and Education Research Collaborative, an exciting report that they have just published recently. We're joined by the director of iWork, Meg Bates, this morning. And then we'll transition to the College and Career Pathway Endorsement Work Group findings. So that was over the spring that the Success Network Policy Committee in this space, we had kind of a special work group to explore some of the challenges and implementation for those CCPE programs within district high schools throughout the state, and explore maybe some, promising local practices as well as systemic and statewide policy recommendations to ease that implementation process. Then we'll switch over to some state policy updates and a preview of veto session coming up here in just a few weeks in October. We will then talk about some general policy committee events and topics that are top of mind for folks this school year. And then we'll wrap up with some reading that we've been doing lately, some announcements and other relevant pieces for the end of our meeting. So without further ado, I'll transition the mic over to Meg. Thank you so much, Meg Bates, for joining us this morning. She's the director of the Illinois Workforce and Education Research Collaborative, and she'll be sharing findings from this really relevant and timely report, Precarious Prospects, College Completion, and the Bridge to Employment for Illinois Students. So thank you, Meg, and take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Madeline. And what a great starter question about back to school. I have to say, like, as a kid, I love getting school supplies. As a parent, it's a much harder experience, but it's good to have those memories. So hello, everybody. I am going to be presenting on a report here that is looking at employment outcomes for Illinois high schoolers from about 10 years ago. And so I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about how this came together, because I think it's really important to kind of share the history here. And then I'll jump into the findings. And honestly, I enjoy more when it's like a casual conversation and people ask questions as I go. So please don't hesitate to, jump in the chat or ask clarifying questions. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. Okay, so a little bit about how this came together. So first of all, I work as a statewide education research group. From the first day that I started, I worked like over 5 years ago, a study of like what happens to our high schoolers in Illinois. Where do they go after high school and what are their economic outcomes was like very high on our list to do. It happened that the U Chicago Consortium on School Research was also very interested in this issue for Chicago Public Schools students. So we kind of teamed up to think about how we could get the data for this study and look at these outcomes. And we were honestly so blessed that these three agencies were willing to explore this with us and really make an effort to help us get a hold of the data to do this kind of study. So those agencies were Illinois Student Assistance Commission, Illinois Department of Employment Security, and Illinois State Board of Education. Awesome partners, not only helped us with data access, they were thought partners, co-authors, just a great team. And the data set that we used is the kind of the back end, the like student level data that makes the website called IllinoisHighSchoolToCareer.com possible. You can see a little screenshot of that website here. I would really encourage you, if you don't know about this tool, to use it and to share it, because what it allows is for members of the public, students, teachers, anyone who wants to use this, to see real economic outcomes from real Illinois students who took different post-high school pathways. So like a very good instructional tool if you're trying to, help your students think through the next steps after high school and think about what their outcomes will be. So big shout out to the agencies that made this possible. Okay, so going forward about the study. So we use data from all of the students in this data set for the senior classes of 2008 to 2012. And so I'll pause right there and say a lot of people are like, oh man, they're so old, they're so long ago. And I totally get it. And things may have changed since then. And we're eager to do this study again if we can. But the reason that they're so old is that we wanted to give 10 years, post high school to look at the economic outcomes of different trajectories. So if you think about it, some people are going to college and you want to give 6 years for that. And then some people might do more than college and you want to let them get settled in a job a little bit before you're looking at it. So that's why it's old. It's kind of purposely old, but we're definitely very open if we can to like repeating this kind of study and seeing how things change. To be included in the study, the students had to have completed the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, and they had to work in Illinois in a stable job 3 years after college, or 3 years after their latest educational event. So if they, were just high school, it was 3 years after that. If they were associate's degree, it was 3 years after that. And they had to be in a stable job, which means 3/4 of consecutive employment. And that's exactly what it means. If you're in, 2025 and you have 3/4 of being in a job. So when you have these kind of criteria, we do have some people that are excluded. So, the biggest one is that we only captured in these data about 25% of students with only a high school education from those cohorts. That's because, a lot of folks who were not pursuing college didn't fill out the FAFSA. And then we also don't have students who worked outside of Illinois, including many of those who went to college out of state and then stayed out of state for their employment. We have a lot of reasons that we think this does not affect the overall takeaways. If anything, we think that maybe our outcomes for high school only are a little overstated, like better than maybe they really are. But we could talk about that. We have a lot about that in the paper, caveats and things like that. But we overall feel this is a very good picture of economic outcomes. Okay, so how did we think about this? So first thing is we had to have a kind of threshold for what makes a student someone who came from a low-income background, from a low-income family. So very luckily, we had parent earnings from the FAFSA. And so we were able to look directly at what students in these cohorts, what their parents earned. And so we separated parent earnings into what are called quintiles, which is just basically separating it into 20%. So there's like, parents who are in the bottom 20% of earnings, and then there were parents who were in the top 20% of earnings. That's quintile 5, and quintile 1 is the bottom 20%. So our definition, if you go forward one, just go one slide forward. So students from low-income families were those in the bottom 2 quintiles, quintiles 1 and 2, so the bottom 40% of parental income, and then the higher income students were the top 60% of income. That's so when we talk about lower income students, higher income, we're talking about being in those different thresholds for their cohorts of parental income. Okay, so what were our research questions were threefold. What were the demographic characteristics of students from low-income households? So we just wanted to understand more about the students who came from these low-income backgrounds. Our second question was, what post-secondary degrees, if any, did students from low-income households attain, and in what programs? So what their major was, or their unit of study. And what industries did these students go on to work in? And then how did students' career earnings vary by the income level of the households in which they grew up? And so a question here might be, why are we focusing on students from low-income backgrounds? The reason is that the goal of this is to kind of understand pathways that might promote more economic equity. If you think about like the ideal American dream is that everyone, no matter where you start, can attain, positive employment, remunerative employment. That's what we wanted to see, is what is the difference here and how far do we have to go in kind of closing those gaps and making that dream real. Okay, so what did we find? So we'll start with the demographic characteristics. So, first of all, I think it's really important to say that the racial ethnic differences are very clear by background. So if you look at our students from middle and high income families, those top 3 quintiles, we see that the top 3 quintiles are much more white. So that like the top quintile is 84% white. and only 9% total Black and Latino. And then as you go down and you're in the bottom quintile of parental earnings, you see that it's actually majority Black and Latino, about 54%. Um, and white students are only 38% of that lowest quintile of earnings. So the pattern here is clear that income background really does correlate heavily with race ethnicity. So if we go on to the next slide, we looked a little bit at geography. So where do we see higher concentrations of low income students? So the graph on the kind of map on the left is counts. So where do we have, by number, the most low income students? And I think unsurprisingly, in our urban areas. So you see Chicago area on the, top right is that deep red because there are many low income students in the Chicago area. Also, you can see around like St. Louis suburbs area as well, East St. Louis. And then if you go to the other map, this is looking at it by proportion within counties. And so this tells a slightly different picture. And I think that's really important is that when you're not just counting people, but you're looking at the proportion of people, we see that low income student populations are actually heavier in some of our downstate rural regions. So this is not, an urban or rural issue. It's an everyone issue to look at these economic outcomes for low income students. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So this is where students from different parental backgrounds and parental income backgrounds ended up in terms of educational attainment. And so let's start at the top. So the students in parent Q5, these are students who came from the wealthiest backgrounds. And we see here that the most common outcome for these students was to have a bachelor's degree, 66%. Now, when we go all the way down to Q1, the students from the lowest income family backgrounds, we see that the most common degree attainment is some college, no degree. That's 54%. So what that means is that they enrolled in an associate degree or bachelor's degree program or even a certificate program, but did not complete it. So they do not have that degree to their resume. And so this is, it's sort of interesting. I think it might challenge maybe a few preconceptions about high school only is actually a very small percentage of the pie. Like most people are doing more than high school. It's 10% in the lowest quintile and 3% in the top, but very small proportion of the whole. Certificates are a very small proportion, slightly higher certificate earning in the students from the lowest income backgrounds. But you see that it's really the difference between a bachelor's degree and some college and no degree. Okay, and that's going to be a very important point as we go forward. Okay, so now let's look at where did students end up. So this is an industry list. These are all the possible industries that students could end up in Illinois. We had to work at the industry level, which is very broad. It can include a lot of jobs, a lot of occupations, but it gives you a general idea of the kind of work that these folks are doing. So the blue line or tealish line that says all industries, that is like the average percentage of students from low-income families in our sample. So about a third of the sample. And then you see that students from low-income families were more likely to be in the industries above that line. So accommodation and food services was the top industry for those folks. Transportation and warehousing, retail trade, etc. And then we look at the ones where they're less common. If you go all the way to the bottom, like the least common industry for low-income students to have ended up in is utilities. Okay, so this is just where they are working in terms of percentage of low-income students. And then let's add this next slide on. This tells you how much they are making. And so this tells a very different story. So what we see is that those industries above the blue line, the ones where low-income students are overrepresented, where we find them more often than we would suspect from their, status in the population as a whole, these are some of the lower earning industries. Accommodation and food services, like just above $20,000 a year. Retail trade, $25,000 a year. So some of the lower earning industries are where low-income students are concentrated. Now we look at the bottom and we see Utilities, one of the highest earning industry, over $70,000 a year, 3 years out from your degree. And it's a very low incidence for students from low income families to be in that industry. So we do see some industry selection issues, some industry concentration issues for why we see some of these disparities in income. Okay, so moving on from industry, just an overall look. So what we see here, and this is, unfortunate, this is what we don't want to see in terms of like access to that American dream, is that students from higher income families to begin with end up earning more. So students from the top parental income quintile 5, ended up earning about $46,000 3 years out. The bottom quintile only about $31,000. So a pretty big, about $15,000 gap in earnings from students from the highest and the lowest income families. Okay, so if we look next, we can also look at this a little bit by race. So these are for each racial ethnic group, we have the count of students in our sample, and we have their career earnings by parental income quintile. So if we look, for instance, at white students at the very top, what we see is that students who came from the highest income backgrounds make more than students who came from the lowest income backgrounds. And we see that for every single racial ethnic group. That is true for every group. But interestingly, we see what we kind of talked about before for Black and Latino students, a higher concentration of students by the green line start out life in these lower parental income quintiles. And we also see that even though like the trend of earning more if your parents made more is true for all groups, we can see that for instance, Asian students, the lowest parental income, so the students who started off in the lowest income backgrounds, still make more than Black and Latino students from the highest income backgrounds. So I think what this shows us and what we want to be clear about saying is that there are income disparities at play here. There are also racial ethnic disparities at play here. And we can't forget that both issues exist at the same time. Looking by gender, you can see that they're, again, same trend. For men and for women, being from a higher income family, you are making more than if you come from a lower income family. But the interesting thing here is that women in general make less than men at each family income background. So, there's also gender disparities in ultimate earnings. Okay, so what about mechanisms that we can change? Things that are malleable, like attending college and so forth. So this is our graph that looks at economic outcomes by each degree level. And so we have all the way from high school only, no subsequent post-secondary training, to a master's or doctoral professional degree, which I will say is a very, very small percentage of our sample, because not many folks in 10 years got through a college degree and a graduate degree. But anyway, what we see here is pretty clear, that with degree level, with more education, the economic payoff is higher. And that is true regardless of your income background, but we still see that students from the lowest income families make less than students from the highest income families at each degree level, except, interestingly, high school only. And if you go to the next slide, this line is put here just to make the point that despite all these disparities that we're talking about, the college degree is still, the bachelor's degree in particular, is still somewhat of an equalizer, because students from the lowest income families who attain a bachelor's degree make more than any other student with any other kind of degree except, a graduate degree. So education is moving people towards that American dream, up that ladder to a great extent. Yet we still see disparities that we would want to close. Okay, so finally, people question, okay, talking about degrees matter, but what about what you get your degree in? And so we're going to go through a few charts here, and it's probably best to kind of sit and take some time with these because there are a lot of different degree programs. But here we see what students from low income families and students from higher income families earn on average with different associate or certificate degrees. So these are your sub-baccalaureate degrees. And what we see is, for instance, construction trades, regardless of your background, it's paying off more than almost any other degree. And then there's some other ones like precision production and engineering and and repair technologies, also very remunerative, although less so for students from our lowest income families. And you can see here there can be quite a spread. Like engineering, that's quite a spread of like what students earn. We go to our bachelor's degree programs on the next slide. See, the spreads get a little smaller in general. So there's less disparity. There's more equalization among students from low income families and higher income families. But you do still see that different degree programs pay off differently. So you've got computer and information sciences. That's one kind of far to the right here near the $70,000 payoff line, math and statistics, engineering. So degree program absolutely matters in the ultimate payoff from a college degree. And yet, if you were to compare kind of the x-axes on both of these charts, the college degree, the bachelor's degree in general pays off more, regardless of degree program. And then finally, we do kind of a look by industry at these different outcomes and these disparities. And so again, we see utilities, that's the number one, that's the big industry payoff. But there's disparities by the background that you're from, but still in all, for anyone, that would pay off in a bigger way. And then you see some industries like accommodation and food services at the lower end of the payoff for everyone. And this is where I think I have to remind that we started with that first chart of where low-income students ended up. They are overrepresented in fields like accommodation and food services that earn less, and they are underrepresented in industries like utilities that earn more. And so when we think holistically about kind of attacking this problem, solving some of these disparities, we have to think about college degree, we have to think about degree program, like program of study, and we have to think about industry and awareness of different industries. So that leads us, I believe, to our key takeaways. Number one, students who earned higher educational degrees went on to earn more on average. This is true for everyone. Doesn't matter where you started. We see that specific degree program and industry mattered. Some were higher earning than others. We see that students from lower income families were less likely to attain higher degrees or work in higher earning industries. So we can target information and resources to help students from lower income families access those degrees and industries. And then even with the same educational degree program, or industry of employment, students from lower income families earned less than those from higher income families on average. And I think that's a very striking and disappointing finding, to see that even if we pull all these levers and students pursue higher education and pursue industries, there are still gaps. But I would caution, those gaps are much less than the gaps by degree program and industry. So the work that you all on this call are doing every day to inform students about different pathways and move students to different pathways is still very, very, very important and is closing a lot of these gaps. But we also have room to grow and do better. And so I'm going to pause there, and we're having some sort of fire drill here at our office, but I can pause here and wait for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Meg, for sharing this research. It's really fascinating and ties in, as you mentioned, so much of the work for folks that are on this call. I particularly appreciated the geographic lens that you gave at the beginning of this is not an urban issue, this is not a rural issue, this is an everywhere issue for low-income students to be able to break into high-paying, high-quality jobs within industries that have that mobility. I'm curious, kind of this last devastating takeaway that you mentioned of like, even with the same degree, same program, same industry, students from lower income families earn less than those from higher income families. I'm curious, like, what could possibly be the kind of kind of the reason that, students are still struggling to have the same employment outcomes, whether it's social capital, networks, things like that. Were there any indicators from the data that could answer that question, or is that kind of a question that you have for further research?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I will say that there is a lot of national literature on this specific issue, and kind of two theories have been explored. So one is around just selectivity of the college that you go to. So for, we do know that students from lower income backgrounds have access to different colleges, enroll in different colleges at higher rates. So that's some of the theory there that's been explored a bit. That is something we'd like to explore further with these data, and we're talking with the state about kind of continuing this work in some way to look at those nuances. So that's theory one. Theory two would be around networking and access to specific industries, internships during, higher during post-secondary training that allow you access to those industries. I think about it as, I think of both issues as like social capital issues. So if your parents went to college, you understand a little more how to navigate college. And there's a lot to navigate at a college: advising, course selection, if you're transferring, what courses will transfer to your major, things like that. I think the same thing is true for industry. If your parents were in a certain industry, or at least like in a professional career, or, aware of and networking with certain industries, you have an advantage in knowing about that access. And one thing I think is really, really interesting, that I don't know if people caught this like tiny thing, but like for high school only, students from lower income families actually had an advantage over students from higher income families in their outcomes. And I wonder if that's because families from those lower income backgrounds are more aware of like opportunities at that high school level. Their networks are within those areas. And so I think like we have to think really carefully about how we, give people these kinds of social capital that seem kind of like surrounding, folks like us whose parents got a college degree or worked in certain kinds of industries. So I know people are doing that work. I know like Braven is a group doing that work. I know 1 Million Degrees thinks about this deeply. So, we just need to continue to kind of push.
Thank you. Point from Amy in the chat as well, wondering how much salary expectations, negotiation, kind of those unwritten rules of, you know, you're told by your parent or your career mentor within your social network of how to kind of bargain for more.
Yep, 100% agree. We had like a discussion about this a couple days ago, where some folks who work in college, who have worked in college counseling and things like that, were talking about how it's just structurally very difficult for colleges to reach every student who would need that kind of, um, you know, knowledge and information about, negotiating salary, applying to different jobs with different salary scales, like looking at your options. Like it's just very difficult. And it's work we need to do more of.
There's one question in the chat, Mang, about are the data available for download? I'm assuming the underlying data would be sort of, maybe you have to tool around on the high school to career site, but I'll repost the landing page for your report as well.
Yeah, I mean, so we used, like confidential student level data to derive this, but you can get a lot out of that site. I mean, you can download by industry and by degree program, and they have some really cool like Sankey diagrams of like, you want to look at everybody in IT and what they studied and how they got there. Like you can look at that. So definitely poke around there, and I do believe a lot of it is downloadable.
Any other questions folks have? Either feel free to come on audio or drop them in the chat. Any wonderings, thoughts that this is sparking for you and your own work?
One quick reflection. The difference between some college no degree, certificate, and associates, those differences between those groups seemed a little smaller than I would have thought a priori. And I'm just curious, your reflections on those differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing to keep in mind is how early this is in career. So it's 3 years, it's 12 quarters or 3 years after your latest educational event. And so we actually know from prior research that the higher degrees have more payoff kind of later in the career because, like you all start out at like an entry level salary from all of these degree programs. And what happens for high school only is that you stay at that entry level salary or very close to it, for a very long time. Whereas the growth potential of an associate or a bachelor's degree, the kind of moving up the ranks is just much more available. So I actually, if I had to guess, I think we are kind of understating here the ultimate earnings gaps that you will see from these different degrees, which I think is kind of alarming if you are on the lower end of the educational spectrum. But yeah, I do think it's a good point, and I think it's because of the earliness of the career. I guess I will like sort of emphasize one point, which we have really been talking a lot and talking about this study, the some college no degree, because I think, it was somewhat surprising to us to see that that is the most predominant bucket for students from lower income families. And so when we talk about to and through college, the through here is very, very important. And so, we can do a lot of things around college readiness, and we should continue. But that through, that is really what's accounting for a lot of the economic disparity we see.
Yeah, that's a great point to raise, especially as, student loan crisis is very real. And so for students to go through some college and take on that, financial burden, but not necessarily have the rewards, outcomes to speak, to show for it. Great reflections in the chat as well. Just a minute or so left in this portion. If anyone has any wrapping up thoughts or questions regarding as you're reflecting on this data and these findings. Yes, the to and through. Super critical.
Well, thank you all for having me. And if you have any additional questions, I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat. Feel free to email me. We're always happy to talk more about this. And sorry, I got a little distracted at the end because there's a fire drill.
Okay, and if you need to evacuate, obviously,
Yeah.
please don't. As important as this meeting is.
Yes.
But it's just a drill.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you, Meg, and thank you, iWork, for this really insightful report. Really will be sticking with me for a while. So thank you. All right. So we're going to transition to something, relevant to the findings, especially as Meg stated at the top of her presentation, that, the goal of their report was to understand those pathways that lead to real economic mobility for students, particularly from low-income backgrounds. And so thinking about how we as policy, practitioners, as educators, whatever role we fill within this pipeline for students, how we can, build out robust programming that really accelerates students on that pathway toward a high quality, role and a high quality, rewarding career for themselves in the future. So in that vein, just this spring, the Success Network Policy Committee convened a work group of folks who were interested in uplifting some of the challenges around college and career pathway endorsements statewide for high school students. So not only uplifting those challenges and implementation, but also sharing some of their kind of creative local solutions to, on a campus and school level, address some of those challenges, but then also brainstorm together what could some systemic kind of policy solutions look like to address some of these challenges that are happening on a more statewide level. So as you may know, of course, CCPE came out of the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act of 2016, but just this July was kind of the Public Act 105 established the deadline for schools to kind of opt out or opt into CCPE programming within their own district. And so with that deadline in mind, we knew that folks on the ground were having a lot of conversations around these challenges. And we wanted to be a place to kind of share those challenges and brainstorm some of the solutions that came out, either on a local or a systemic level. And so from the findings of the work group, we had both a qualitative and quantitative survey that we launched within the work group. And I'll mention as well, it was about 40 stakeholders throughout the state representing, educators, administrators, intermediary groups, EFEs, all different areas of the pipeline that may potentially touch CCPE programming. And within that group of 40, we had folks from, urban, rural, suburban, all different corners of the state, sharing what their unique experiences were, in addition to kind of some just open conversation sessions within the work group to speak more candidly about some of the challenges that they were having in implementing college and career pathway endorsements and what that looked like for them on the ground. So as a refresher, if maybe you're not directly in this work, but interested in kind of the implications for your own work, in the top right corner, that icon shows the, components of the CCPE, the endorsement that students can earn on their high school diploma. So there are 4 components that go into successful completion of the CCPE. All of them are kind of anchored under this individual planning component. So like Meg mentioned, those really one-on-one personal conversations with students about their own aspirations, talents, skills, interests, maybe what pathways they've thought about for themselves within their own social and family communities, in addition to kind of what locally is available within their local economy, their local chamber of commerce, their, as they're thinking about going elsewhere in the state or out of state, like what that looks like for them. So that individual planning component kind of serves to wrap up all of these other components into a nice, package for students to be able to comprehensively follow throughout their high school career. But included in that is professional learning. So making sure that students have those opportunities to engage with work-based learning and career development experiences beyond the classroom and kind of get that hands-on perspective into what that potential career pathway looks like. Career-focused instruction, so a focus on dual credit that, ties into their career pathway. It isn't just kind of a random act of dual credit that, while it may be interesting for students, we want to make sure that it's connected to their potential career aspirations and post-secondary journeys. And then, of course, academic readiness. So ensuring that students are academically ready for that next step into post-secondary education. And so within those 4 components, folks raised kind of 4 main buckets of challenges that arose in implementing these different categories. So primarily those challenge areas were found within professional learning and within career-focused instruction. So these 4 challenge buckets that I'll go through now primarily fell under those 2 components of the CCPE. And the first kind of speaks to a lot of what came out of the memo that I'll share in just a few moments, is this partnerships piece. So regardless of, where students were located, again, as Meg said, this is not an urban issue or a rural issue. This is everywhere, that practitioners were really struggling with establishing those partnerships with either post-secondary institutions for dual credit and kind of shining the light up for students on what that post-secondary pathway looks like, but also with employers. So particularly in rural areas where there may be few employer partners in the area. And so kind of the selection pool of potentially interested employers may be more limited, but also, of course, across different geographies of the state, just establishing that communication between secondary and post-secondary, secondary and employer, to make sure that employers and post-secondary really understand what the CCPE is designed to deliver for students, that it's accelerating students from high school into their post-secondary journey, into their career. And really, as we'll talk about in just a moment, it's kind of a mindset shift from maybe typically what older generations have envisioned as the purpose of high school or the types of activities that students are doing in high school. And so within that challenge bucket, we heard folks were really struggling to kind of market this to industry of, what is this? What's the value proposition for industry? And of course, we can go on about the tremendous value proposition in that employers now have this excited and interested and eager and talented pipeline of students coming up that are interested in their industry and local and want to stick around and contribute to their communities in that way. But that was something that folks were finding was kind of a missing piece in how they were communicating to those employer partners or potential employer partners. Challenge bucket number 2, of course, with the 4 components of the CCPE, folks were saying that they were struggling with the operations component, right? So all of the how to, get from point A to point B, how to schedule these experiences for students, how to fund these opportunities for students, how to, in a state where we already know counselors within high schools are maybe overburdened with their caseloads being too high, and that, this being kind of a mindset shift for folks was a struggle for many stakeholders within the group to share just, the value of the CCPE and what doors it can open for students. Not only, the scheduling, the transportation, the counseling and advising required within the CCPE, but also just the ownership of the components, right? So when you're engaging with so many external partners, folks were sharing that, it became difficult to know, okay, who's owning what? If I don't have a dedicated college and career navigator at my school, whose plate does this fall onto? Of course, within school systems that folks already wear many different hats. And then, of course, transportation. So if, folks are coordinating opportunities with employers outside of the campus within the school day, that was a big challenge for the operations bucket as well. Moving into challenge bucket 3, so student recruitment, access, and equity. So when we do, folks were sharing that when they were able to kind of get these CCPE pathways up and running, that getting students to make the choices that, hey, this is something that is good for me to further my college and career journey, when maybe they had other competing priorities, whether it's a part-time job outside of school, or, taking a different class other than that dual credit class. And we really found that there were some uplifting kind of recruitment practices that we'll share in just a moment that opened the door for different students, but that student characteristics, as Meg was mentioning earlier, with kind of the demographics of students and, the eventual industries and occupations that students go into, that was definitely a theme brought up within this work group as well. That, for example, students who, maybe were interested in something like education or healthcare, were having trouble kind of understanding kind of the benefit long-term for themselves when maybe that immediate career development experience was unpaid, whereas something maybe that is more male-centric, like manufacturing, could offer a more robust immediate benefit for students in addition to kind of the long-term benefits. And so we want to think about the currency, so the incentives and the end goal for students when they're reaching completion of the CCPE, and what that translates into for students in their real life kind of pros and cons that they are establishing for themselves and their choices of next steps. And then finally, challenge bucket 4 was the CCPE approval process. So getting these 4 components together, translating that into, the application for state agency supervising, so the Illinois State Board of Education, proved to be a challenge for some folks on the work group, just in the sense that, and we'll talk about, kind of changes that have already been made at the agency level to kind of ameliorate some of these challenges. But in terms of, wording up the applications and team-based challenges, maybe perceived inconsistency and kind of how these applications were reviewed. And so some frustration there and maybe lack of decrease in momentum when schools and administrators were finding applications rejected or missing pieces that were kind of tricky to track down. And again, back to that ownership piece. And then, of course, the data collection component as well, just adding to the cumbersome nature of the approval process that folks were kind of clamoring for some top-down kind of simple swaps that could make that approval process a little bit easier and make sure that all of the hard work that went into designing the CCPE would not go to waste in the approval process. So as I mentioned in that partnerships challenge, a reoccurring theme that we saw within the work group was this idea that implementing CCPE is the work of shifting human systems. And so, I think about us as kind of a group of adults that are designing these pathways, that are advocating for pathways within our own communities or in policy, and all of the different players that kind of need to be brought to the table in order to shift the system that maybe previously looked at students as, high school students as completing their high school diploma, going on to, college or, community college 4-year degree, then entering the workforce. And that kind of linear binary thinking that is being disrupted by the CCPE and in so many other kind of trends that we see nowadays in the way that we're shifting how we think about work and think about career development for students, is this work of shifting human systems. And so for this director of innovation and learning at a large suburban district, she just articulated the need for those kind of human conversations of, yes, this is maybe different from what you experienced in your own high school years, but this is kind of the benefit for you as an employer, or this is how it kind of embeds within a student's larger academic journey and can, not only accelerate their progress toward success in your field, but also open up doors for future development for themselves within the workforce as well. And so as we kind of sifted through those challenges within the work group of all of the different elements of implementation that were proving challenging for practitioners, we really wanted to uplift all of the expertise we had within the room. So folks that, despite these challenges, had made tremendous progress in building and scaling these pathways for students, whether, 3 or 4 pathways or, close to 10 or a dozen, different pathways that they were able to get students in progress and on their way to whatever their post-secondary or career next step was. And so uplifting some of these practices, again, mention this theme of the work of shifting human systems. So what does that really look like in practice? So folks mentioned this continuum approach, and this is something that has come out of work from within our ed systems team as well, of just uplifting kind of the different ways that industries across the state can think about this continuum. But essentially what it means is allowing different levels of participation and engagement for employers. So it doesn't seem like kind of an all or nothing approach, right? So it allows employers the opportunity to kind of dip their toe in the water, see how this engagement is working for them, whether it's something as simple as setting up a career booth at a fair within the high school campus, or hosting a student for a career development experience and that more robust 60-hour, 30-hour work experience that students will have more hands-on experience with their industry. And then another practice that came up in this kind of theme of shifting human systems is the importance of group collaboration. So not just having kind of one-off, bidirectional conversations with your partner in the employer space or the industry space, but really creating kind of a roundtable conversation of, hey, post-secondary partner, hey, employer, we're all in the business of, improving economic outcomes for our community. We're all in the business of supporting, whether it's our employees or our students to grow and to learn and to, challenge themselves and grow, both for themselves and for our institutions. What are some ways that we can create shared vision, create shared goals? And that was found to really lift a lot of the challenge from stakeholders' plates in those kind of one-off conversations, instead having more of like a shared vision approach. Another promising practice that folks lifted up was just focusing on existing strengths. It sounds simple, but focus on within our community. What do we do well within our school building? What do we have strengths in? What does our staff or faculty have expertise in that we can build pathways out of, that existing strength? Again, sharing with employers and local industry that value proposition of having that access to local and enthusiastic talent that is accelerated toward their post-secondary journey and accelerated toward the career that they work in. And then also supporting teachers to kind of be champions of CCPE themselves. So taking some of kind of the logistics and operations pieces off of their plate, whether it's the template for a team-based challenge that we saw one stakeholder created for her whole district to use, and really just kind of taking that, the TDM out of the CCPE programming and allowing educators and allowing folks to really get more into kind of the pedagogical approach of what does this really mean for students to be exploring a career opportunity, a pathway within the high school container. And then finally, creativity, of course, is the name of the game a lot of times with resource constraints. And so especially where their employer partners were few and far between, creativity and kind of scrappiness came into play a lot as recommendations from local folks. So considering virtual or school-based career development experiences, we have a couple examples linked here that'll be shared in the slides after this session. But whether it's virtual or school-based, maybe food service or IT, existing strengths within your campus that you can build out to support pathways was a huge recommendation from folks in the group as well. And then finally, just flagging that folks found the ISB work-based learning employer database to be helpful. So folks had to, employers did have to opt in to share their information and kind of the level of engagement that they wanted to offer. And so that's a tremendous resource as well to find local employers to tap for this opportunity as well. And so, of course, we can't, fix these systemic challenges solely on the local level. And the group did surface some of these system level recommendations to address implementation challenges. So, I won't go through this laundry list one by one, but kind of, again, bucketed into approval on operations, thinking about how can we streamline this from an agency perspective. We've already heard in our collaboration with ISB, tremendous progress just in their internal review of applications and how to kind of streamline that and make that more consistent and transparent for applicants. Things like, creating or, building on the existing strength of organizations like ISAC that have the ISAC core of students who are recently in those shoes to offer advising, to offer support of what does this pathway look like? What are the doors that are open to you? And that could be a tremendous support for students as well. And for schools, frankly, to kind of take the lift off of counselors. Of course, currency and incentives for students for completion of CCPE was a huge piece that we recommend for policymakers and state leaders to really think about how can we support on a local level development of this currency for colleges to offer scholarships for students who have completed the CCPE, or industry to offer first round interviews. But not only kind of having those ad hoc currency pieces, but really how can we support this on a statewide level so that it is consistent throughout the state, and that again, that awareness builds for CCPE, and the weight that it carries for students and the doors that it can open, regardless of geography throughout the state. And then, of course, partnerships supports from the state could include, creating that model business partnership template for materials for schools to use in their outreach to employer partners, micro grants to support those partnerships, whether it's for transportation or for school-based career development experiences, to staff and to resource those opportunities. And then finally, a little bit more creatively on the state level is reaching out to other state agencies, DCEO, IDFPR, to really reach businesses at that incubation and initial licensure phase to share with them, hey, this is a tremendous opportunity for you to build your workforce from local talent. And here are some of the ways that you can do that with your local secondary partners. And so all of this to say that our findings from this work group have been published this week on our Illinois Success Network website. So thank you, Emily, dropping that in the chat. We have not only the memo, which kind of goes through those challenges and local and systemic recommendations, but then also a kind of one-pager that you'll see on the right here that just highlights those local practices. So kind of more of a grab and go approach of, what could work in your own community? What are kind of those more creative, scrappy, local level solutions that you can implement, this school year or in your planning for next school year? And so we're continuing to kind of socialize and elevate these findings and recommendations. We recently presented with College of Lake County at the College Changes Everything conference this past July. And we're also continuing our collaboration with relevant state agencies to see how we can materialize these recommendations as well and get them into practice to support CCPE implementation. And so again, these resources can be found on the Success Network site, but thank you for listening. And I welcome, any thoughts or questions, concerns, anything like that in the chat. I'll be hanging on, of course, throughout the call, but I do know we are headed to our next session or our next segment of the agenda. So I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts in the chat, but for now, I'll hand it over to Emily to give us some state policy updates and a preview of veto session coming up in a few weeks.
Thanks, Madeline. And like you said in the chat, just thank you to everyone in the work group for participating. The discussions were super insightful and just really valuable work happening there. And also shout out to Madeline for leading this work. She had just started on the Ed Systems team and basically jumped in feet first and has done an incredible job of shepherding that work through. So I just want to very, very loudly celebrate that work and really excited to dive into the memo and that info's in the chat. So I'm actually, my first act as leading this section is going to hand off to Laura Monagudo from our team as our Pathways Manager to talk through some updates to the Perkins Model Programs of Study Guide. So Madeline, go ahead and advance the slide, and Laura, take it away.
Yeah, hi everybody. Excited to be here. I feel like it's been a minute since I was on with this group and you haven't seen my face in a while. But I just wanted to share some things that our Pathways team has been working on, some new and updated resources. So many of you may already be familiar with the Model Program of Study Guides. If you're not familiar, just kind of like a brief explanation. Those start with labor market information to really identify priority credentials, and then they back map from either the credential or degree that is required for those priority occupations. And they map out courses sort of as a suggestion, starting with, ninth grade, front loading some of those CTE courses, building to more career focused dual credit classes. And they actually map through the first year of post-secondary. So these are really great if you're building out pathways or, looking to improve your pathways to have kind of a model that the state has set for, I think there's 10 different ones. So for all the different, endorsement areas, industry focuses, we've been updating those a few at a time to make sure that the most accurate labor market information is reflected. Most recently, we updated culinary and hospitality. And then we also added electric vehicle careers in there. There's a third one that we updated that I can't remember off the top of my head, but the updates have all been made and published. And then a whole new piece here that I want to talk about a little bit is our companion guide. So whether or not this is your first time hearing about the model programs and study guides, if you open up the link Emily just sent, you'll see they're pretty detailed. There's really a lot of information there. And I like to kind of explain it as like those guides are sort of like the 300, 400 level class, right? If you're new to working with pathways or developing pathways, those guides might be a little bit overwhelming. So what we did with partnership of ICCB is we put together a companion piece. So this companion piece is sort of the 101 to everything you need to know or think about to understand and really effectively utilize the program of study guides. So it's broken up in kind of three main components. The first one is just everything you need to know before you even start reading the program of study guides. So that's some of the policy context that Madeline and Emily helped us out with that part. So props to them. Some of the policy context, differentiating some of those terms that you hear used interchangeably a lot that aren't necessarily interchangeable. So program versus program of study versus career pathway. How do those things work together? How are they different? Really going down into how Perkins defines a program of study and how all of that works together when you talk about CTE, when you talk about dual credit, when you talk about work-based learning. I feel like we're used to talking about a lot of those things as individual components, but how are they actually working together in the best ways and kind of bringing our systems together? And then the next piece is sort of things to be thinking about or doing while you're reading the guide. So those things include, step-by-step process for labor market information. So as I mentioned, the guides kind of start with the labor market information, but it's all for the state. This is a statewide model. If you really wanted to dig into your local area and the more specific labor market information, there's step-by-step guides on how to do that. Throughout, as we're talking about different pieces, there are also sort of sidebars with either some tips on implementation guidance or some reflection questions to really help you think about what your district or region is doing, or what you want to do. And then obviously, last piece that's really important to us is just thinking about how we can address any student access gaps. So making sure all students have access, understand, and are aware of the opportunities that are available to them when they're doing a program of study. And then the last piece is sort of to help identify next steps. Make sense of everything you just read, both in the companion guide, in the guides, with a really comprehensive implementation checklist where you can go through and say, oh, we've done this. Oh, wait, maybe we haven't done this and we should. So you can really kind of assess where you're at and identify some action items. So that is what I have to share with you all today. I will hand it back to Emily. I'll stick on, so if anyone has questions about either resource in the chat, I'd be happy to help answer them.
Thank you, Laura, and shout out to the Pathways team for developing those updated resources. And we'll flag also that, we are having conversations with ISB and other partners about how the new like national career clusters will impact this work. So that is something that is in development. There are no immediate answers, but that is work that is sort of in development. So wanted to flag that as well. We can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Thank you. And I know that Adrian, I see you're on the line here. Just wanted to share an update with this group. At our last meeting, we were reflecting on the legislative session in which bills had passed. One of those bills that had passed was a Dual Credit Quality Act amendment. I won't go into depth about the changes involved. It involves updates to some of the partnership processes, most critically. And I just wanted to flag that there's been really robust interagency collaboration on this. I know that folks had a lot of questions and wonderings about the new normal around dual credit that is being is coming out of this amendment that again reshapes some of the partnership processes, et cetera. And I just want to shout out ISB and ICCB and IBHE who have been really in the weeds of collaborating and really focusing on what will it look like to really make sure that it's clear how secondary and post-secondary can and should be aligned on scaling strategic and high quality dual credit in ways that meet the needs of various folks within the system. So just wanted to provide that update, and that, there's a lot of work underway at the Illinois Community College Board, ICCB, around rulemaking and research development and identifying where there are procedural changes to really convert this new law into the practical action that is happening on the ground in the field. And so ICCB has also convened for the first time the dual credit committee that's called for in the Public Act in this new law. And they are working on a website for that committee where, because it's subject to the Open Meetings Act, to provide information about when that committee is convening, what they're talking about, et cetera. But broadly, what that committee is meant to do is be a representative body that takes into consideration data, policy, et cetera, to think about what does dual credit policy need to look like in the state, what types of changes may to be made. So more information certainly to come as ICCB continues to develop those rules, and eventually we'll put them out for public comment. I think we anticipate that happening later this year, and we will certainly be in touch with the committee when that information is more available. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. Another big update in the state policy landscape is that ISB changed proficiency cut scores. So ISB adopted unified performance levels and what they are calling right-size proficiency benchmarks for designating how we determine how students are marked as ready for that next step within their school journey, and that spans our K-12 system. That means that the cut scores have shifted at multiple grade levels. The tests have changed because the state has shifted to ACT from SAT. This has downstream impacts for a number of different pieces of state policy. That includes the College and Career Readiness Indicator under ESSA, which many folks from this group were really involved in influencing when our state ESSA plan was being developed. But it also impacts things like our automatic acceleration policies and other pieces of the puzzle. So just wanted to flag this. Probably most of you are aware of this. We released a blog post on it last month, I believe now. I don't know what month it is. It's September, I guess maybe earlier this month. These cut scores will be reflected in the October 2025 report card release. So the end of October is when the Illinois report card gets released every year. There are a lot of resources on the ISB website that's linked in this slide. And again, we'll share all of this out with you, but about how you make sense of these new proficiency scores and the unified performance levels, et cetera. I think one thing that we're looking out for from the Ed Systems vantage point is how high schools will be supported to make sense of differences based on the fact that, the cut scores were different for certain cohorts of students, and that we're shifting to different tests and different cut scores. And being mindful of what that means over time, right? And recognizing that these different cohorts of students have experienced our systems in profoundly different ways, COVID being a really primary impact there, and how we can think about making sense of these numbers in order to inform continuous improvement. So one of those tools that will eventually be available are student growth percentiles. But that is something that's a newer collection for high schools, or that's going to be a newer data point for high schools. And so it's not going to be as effective in the short term for kind of comparisons over time. Our next slide is just flagging that veto session is coming up here in a few weeks. There's a lot of conversations happening in the state right now around budget and federal policy shifts and federal budgetary shifts, and how that's going to impact our state budget and what that might bring up in veto session. There's obviously an executive order out from Governor Pritzker around cutting spending at our state agencies by 4% across the board. We anticipate in veto session, in terms of topics that are very directly relevant to this group, that two of those big kind of higher ed proposals will kind of come back up here. We know that the community college baccalaureate issue is going to come up big time in veto session, and we do also anticipate a lot more conversations around the adequate and equitable funding for higher ed formula. So if there's any other topics that you're looking out for in veto session, please drop those in the chat. But these are the ones that we think are most likely to be sort of active in veto session. And then we'll obviously look ahead to the 105th General Assembly next spring. My last bucket of updates is just some updates from our friends at ISAC. So there were a couple of laws that were passed in this last session that impact things around FAFSA and advising and direct admissions to our state's public institutions. So three laws that were passed. One, two that have to do with FAFSA, right? So one, every high school has to designate a point of contact for FAFSA related issues, right? So we have FAFSA as a high school graduate completion of FAFSA or a waiver as a high school graduation requirement. This designates these points of contact for high schools that will help facilitate coordination with ISAC and other entities as they are providing support for FAFSA completion at those high schools. And then two, that every public high school has to offer help during the school day for students to complete FAFSA, right? So one of the burdens of FAFSA sometimes is just not having adequate support to complete it and when you need that support and when that can be available. So the school can determine the format for the help, but a lot of schools will do sort of workshops or in-class activities, et cetera. And that kind of goes hand in hand with this designee piece. And certainly that is coming with lots and lots of support from ISAC that is available. And they do all sorts of webinars, all sorts of in-person supports with the ISAC core near peer mentors, et cetera. The third piece from ISAC, and I'll go a little bit more in depth on this, is One Click College Admit. So this is our state's guaranteed admissions pilot our program, direct admissions program. And this was reinforced with a law this year that was signed, or a bill that was signed into law this year around direct admissions. But basically what it does is it reduces barriers to access of our public universities and community colleges for general admission, right? So there's certainly lots of programs that require specialized applications. This won't address that, but this will open the door to a lot of students who might not otherwise know that they would be eligible for entry into some of our public institutions. And so what it is that it's eligibility based on a student's high school GPA. It eliminates the requirement for submitting essays for general admission. It eliminates application fees. The universities and colleges that are participating have waived their application fees for this. And I'll go into more depth about what the process looks like, but there will be two versions of this available this year. And then next year, there will only be one available version of it that's a little bit more automated. So for the current class, we can go to the next slide. For the current class of 2026, basically what it is that a student a current high school senior can create their Common App account and profile. They submit required information, so their GPA, their address, et cetera. And then they will receive an email and information via the Common App that tells them which of the public universities on the right-hand side here are eligible for admission to. And again, that's based on their self-reported GPA, and that is guaranteed admission. And then the student can accept an offer and through the Common App and work through those processes. But this really reduces a lot of barriers for students. So this is what the version is for the class of 2026. On the next slide, we've got what is going to be the version for the class of 2027 and beyond. So this fall, the class of 2027 is our juniors. And so what they will do is they will opt in. The student needs to opt in. Their parent or guardian needs to complete the opt-in form. I believe there's an exception, obviously, if students are already 18, but for many students, that's not going to be the case. But they have to opt in the fall of their junior year. What will happen from there is that ISAC will use data from ISB to match that student's GPA with the GPA admission requirements at the participating public universities, again, listed on the right-hand side. And obviously, our community colleges are open enrollment, so they are eligible for admission to any community college in the state. But in the fall of their senior year, after ISAC has done the behind-the-scenes matching of these data, the students will receive admissions offers right to their email, and then the student can make choices about accepting those offers. Again, these offers are for general admission. These do not apply to specialized programs within a university. So, for example, if they are being admitted to Northern Illinois University and they want to enter into a special engineering program, there are going to be additional steps for them to be admitted into that program, but they may be eligible based on their GPA for admission to NIU more generally. I will drop the link in the chat in a minute here to the One Click College Admit site, but we're really excited about this progress in the state. This is going to reduce a lot of barriers for a lot of students. Our colleagues at ISAC and the Community College Board and BHE have been working really hard on this, and just want to shout them out for the amazing work they're doing to increase access for our students across Illinois. And I'll hand it back to Madeline.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Laura, for sharing those relevant, timely local updates. So just to kind of wrap us up, thinking ahead to the rest of the school year. So we'd love to hear from you all of what other topics you'd like to see covered in this space. So, this is just kind of a starting list of potential ideas just with what's coming up legislatively. But whether chronic absenteeism, dual credit quality act, upcoming kind of federal changes to workforce Pell and high quality credentials, but would love to kind of hear any ideas that you have for things that are top of mind for you and your community, the types of work that you'd like to hear elevated or shared, either from local practitioners or from more of a research perspective, like we heard from iWork earlier this morning, or any topics that you would like to present on and share your knowledge, your expertise, your perspective with folks in this group. So this will be part of our closing survey that I'll just launch in a couple minutes here, but just start brainstorming what other ideas you have of topics that are relevant for you at this stage in the school year. And then just to flag some upcoming resources and events. So some, what we're reading, just things that have been on our own desks of providing some insights and research on a national level, particularly from the Ed Strategy Group, a recent report on accountability and transforming high school measurement. So what and why, we're measuring student success, future ready pathways. So thinking about how we evolve pathways to the ever evolving labor market, especially in light of impacts to the labor market from AI and other relevant shifts. And then, of course, an Ed Systems report as well recently released of what helped, what didn't, honest feedback from manufacturing pathway students. So that's really some great insight to student perspectives on how manufacturing pathways have served their future success. Some other upcoming events to keep in mind and mark your calendars. So To and Through has a spotlight coming up on October 7th. So sparking engagement in middle grades for post-secondary and career exploration. Toward the end of October on the 27th, there's an iWin community of practice for team-based challenges. So great spot to share challenges and brainstorm kind of best practices in terms of those team-based challenges that we mentioned being challenging for CCPE implementation. Another iWin roundtable for developing regional employer partnerships. So partnerships being another huge component of CCPE on November 12th. Our next policy committee meeting for the winter will be December 3rd. So that's a Wednesday. Hope you're able to join us 9:30 to 11, just as we met this morning. And then some ongoing, ISAC has some awesome professional development opportunities linked here as well. And then some open surveys as well from ACTE of accessibility in CTE, as well as thinking about some of the direct impacts of federal policy shifts on Illinois folks. So definitely check those surveys out and share your perspectives. And then another event that we'd love to showcase and get everyone excited for is the Success Network's annual conference. So this will take place at Moraine Valley Community College in Palos Hills, and the date is Thursday, February 26th. So registration to come, but mark your calendars. Super excited to see a lot of you there and connect over some really thoughtful presentations and discussions that I know always come out of this gathering. All right, so I'll launch our ending survey. So please just take a moment to answer a few brief questions, multiple choice ranking questions, and then again, sharing any ideas you have for topics you'd like to see covered, speakers you'd like to hear from. Maybe that speaker is you. Share your name and contact info. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Great to see so many of you in the space. And I look forward to our continued collaboration.